This is our topic to Cycle 1 homework video for forces. As you watch this video, you're going to be asked a multiple choice question and a free response question at the end. If you look at the site where you found this video, right below it there's a button where you click to submit those answers. So our goal here was to figure out what is a force. And we defined a force originally as a push or a pull. So that was our simple definition of what a force is. We're also using a force to talk about a transfer of energy. Now, going into your lab, that's what you had from our class, and you may have learned other things before. And then in our lab, we looked at how forces, what's the nature of a force, and we found that a force is an interaction between two objects. So there's always two objects. We also found that forces always come in pairs, and we described that as a paired force that's equal in amount but opposite in direction. So when you're pushing on your partner's scale, if they could hold their scale there, they would always have a reading. They could not prevent themselves from exerting a force in the opposite direction. And the same thing with our spring scales. You pulled and your partner just tried to hold it there, and you pulled with 10 newtons and their spring scale said 10 newtons in the opposite direction. So now we're going to take it a step further and look at types of forces. So contact forces, that's when two objects come into direct contact with each other, like the bathroom scales did. And non-contact forces, one like gravity, where you could jump off the earth, but gravity is still pulling you down. It does not have to be in contact for that force to be exerted or that energy to be transferred. And when we have a scenario of what's going on, we're going to create an interaction diagram that shows these interactions between objects and the forces between them. But first, take this opportunity to pause your video. Again, there's that button right below where you found the video that says click here to answer your homework questions. And pause right now and say, what is the best definition of a force? A push or a pull, a transfer of energy, an interaction between two objects, an interaction that always results in a paired force equal in amount but opposite in direction, or all of the above. So the first thing I'm going to do for my interaction diagram is I'm going to draw the earth on the bottom. If our feet were on the ground, I would also add a line here to put the ground on top of that. Here in our picture, we don't have the ground there, but I would add the ground right here on top. So if they were pictured sitting on the ground, I would add the ground right there. Now we add the earth there so that we can account for gravity, a non-contact force. Once we've added the earth, we're going to go ahead and look at my non-contact force. The non-contact force that we're going to focus on is gravity. And gravity occurs between each object and the earth. It occurs between all objects, but the gravity is greatest between the earth and us because the earth is so massive. So let's take a look at, we connect each object with an arc to the earth to represent gravity. So our student here, we connect an arc from the earth to that student and label it with a G for gravity. The scale also has an interaction. If we let go of it, it would fall right to the ground. So there's a gravitational force between the earth and the scale. Same for the second scale and the second student. Notice that the arc connects the two objects that are in the force pair. The earth pulls down on the student. The earth pulls down on the scale. Those are the two objects involved in the force pair. Then we're going to look at the other forces present, the contact forces. A push or a force applied perpendicular to the object is called a normal force. So we're labeling those with an N. And this occurs between the student. So there's the student's hand on one side and the scale. You know, the scale pushes back on the hand as well because that's our force pair. So this arc represents the force pair and the letter tells me the type of force. The student's other hand also applies a normal force to the scale. The second student here, her hand applies a normal force to her scale, and then the scales, there's a force between the two scales. So the scales are pushing on each other. So the scale on the left is pushing with a normal force on the scale on the right, and vice versa. The scale on the right is pushing with a normal force on the scale on the left. After we label our arcs, we look to see if we have any other forces. If we had tension, like a pull from a string, that was like in our spring scale, we'd label it with a T. And if we had friction, like something was sliding across a surface, or for example, you're walking and pushing off the ground, those are examples of friction, and we'd label that as another contact force we'd label with an F. Finally, I would add contact forces and list them in the upper left, list non-contact forces in the upper right. Here we don't have any tension, there's no pull going on in the picture, and we don't see any friction. so those are not listed here. Gravity is going to be the only non-contact force we really focus on in this unit. There's other non-contact forces like electric force or magnetic force, but that gravity is going to be our main focus here. So the key being that the arc connects the two objects that are in the force pair. So the scale on the left pushes on the scale on the right with a normal force. That means the scale on the right pushes back on the scale on the left, so the opposite direction, but the same amount of force. In class, our next step will be to create a force diagram from this, to circle an object and create a force diagram. We're going to hold off on that for now and go over that in class. Your free response question I'd like you to answer. I'd like a short 2 to 3 sentence answer about what each arc represents in an interaction diagram. Talking about the importance of the endpoint, why the arc, where it ends on either side, and then the letter labeling it. So pause your video, go back on the video to look at the interaction diagram we went over, if you need to review it, and then go ahead and submit your work. You should receive an email in your SHCP email saying that you've submitted your work when you do turn it in.